World War II. Best known for its extreme destruction and heavy casualties, almost anyone today would tell you that it's the largest conflict the world has ever experienced. But we tend to think about World War II as a big picture. We know the names of the people who tended to start and end conflicts, we know big battles that became turning points of the war, and most of all, we know events that cost the lives of millions of unarmed citizens. Right now, I want to focus on the tiny details, that being the lives of Japanese Americans after the bombings of Pearl Harbor, and more importantly, what rights were taken away from them, and how many took the responsibility to try to bring them back. Since the beginning of World War II, the United States sought to avoid any conflicts nor wanted to join in. In fact, 94% of Americans didn't want to go to war. The US instead opted out to help the Allies by providing equipment such as guns and food. Now on the other side, the Japanese have slowly been modernizing their technologies, especially after the arrival of Western influences in the mid-19th century. They've grown to create a stronger military and a stronger hatred towards the European and American influences around their country. Since signing the Tripartite Pact, Japan now plans to conquer China, and especially the Pacific Ocean, in which they believed if they conquered they would gain an advantage. And they were right, because most of the islands in the Pacific contained US military bases, and most importantly Hawaii, which contained Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japan sent out 353 planes to Pearl Harbor, in which many aimed their aircrafts to collide with the military bases, totaling in over 3,000 casualties, 8 battleships, and 188 planes. This day will then mark the start of not only the assistance of the United States in World War II, but also the beginning of Japanese Americans' struggle for freedom. Japanese Americans wanted to pursue the American dream. They've, much like other immigrants, worked numerous kinds of jobs and even established diasporic communities around the East Coast. Anti-Japanese sentiments in America began to increase after Pearl Harbor. Loads of propaganda meant to fearmonger and bring racist remarks began to spread throughout America. They've made sure to constantly remind people of the horror of Pearl Harbor and often wanted to guilt-trip people into thinking they've not done enough to ensure Japan will pay for what they've done. And obviously, this hatred was often directed to Japanese Americans even though they too were American citizens. This mix of hatred and fear of Japanese Americans labeled them as the enemy, or more commonly during that time, the Yellow Peril. These feelings began to take over the government, and on February 19, 1942, a paper wrote in big bold letters, "Instructions to all persons with Japanese ancestry." This was an executive order, Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. A direct order to intern all 120,000 Japanese Americans. Many tried to justify the internment, believing that this act was protecting the Japanese, but there was no hiding the fact that the rights of Japanese Americans were being violated. Their homes, friends, and money were all abandoned as they began to move them almost immediately. Families were even separated but had no choice but to continue marching along. George Takei, a Japanese American actor best known for his appearance in Star Trek, Lieutenant Hikaru, has experienced this. Here's how he described the process.
They carried bayonets on their rifle. They stomped up the front porch and banged on the door. My father answered it, and these soldiers ordered us out of our home. She had our baby sister in one arm, a huge duffel bag in the other, and tears were streaming down both her cheeks. I will never be able to forget that scene. It is burned into my memory. Everything had been taken from us, and the hostility was intense. It was a horrible experience, and for us kids, it was terrorizing.
He mentions that alongside losing their possessions, their identity as an American was disregarded. Although the enemy was once again a nickname towards Japanese Americans, America's actions have made it clear to me that the enemy was rather a fitting nickname for the US instead. The internment of Japanese Americans was sudden. Internment camps were still being set up as hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans moved to temporary assembly centers. Some were even transferred to animal cells held in barns. They were temporarily placed there as 10 internment camps were established around the area of California, Arizona, and Utah, just to name a few. Then, as the Japanese Americans began to arrive in their internment camps, soldiers began to set up fences and barbed wires that surrounded the place. It was then clear that this camp was made to feel more like a prison than anything. Many would take notes, write stories, and often speak about their occurrences. Another significant person I found was Pat Morita. Best known for his role of Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid, he would recall his early life in the camp.
Anyway, I went there. I stayed about a year and a half, and we moved from Gila to Tule Lake. And the reason for that was my grandfather on my mother's side, he ended up in Tule Lake with my uncle.
What Pat Morita highlights here as well was the constant moving they've had to do. Most people didn't stay in a singular camp forever, though some did, but many would move around different camps, which broke any friendships or relations between people. About the conditions in the camps, people slept in barracks which were uninsulated and didn't supply much of hot water. Dry, humid conditions or cold, freezing weather were unforgiving, and people would have to do the best they can to survive it. Though the living conditions were tough, camps often included schools, hospitals, and even churches. Teens and kids would find the silver lining in the situation by playing sports or learning instruments. People in general did the best they could to bring their culture and sense of community together when they faced the same circumstances. Now during this time, there was a fair share of people who placed their best efforts into fighting back. Gordon Hirabayashi, for example, protested against the strict curfew rules which required all Japanese people to stay in their homes between 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. Hirabayashi took this matter to court and argued that this curfew either applies to everyone or no one at all. He followed the same attitude towards their incarceration as well. Another person was Fred T. Korematsu, who even underwent plastic surgery to look more like a white man to avoid internment. But he was soon arrested after protesting his internment, and the court ruled against Korematsu and justified the internment as a military necessity, not based on race. 40 years later, in 1982, Korematsu reopened his case, and when he was asked why he did it, he responded, "I would like to see the government admit that they were wrong and do something about it, so this will never happen to any American citizen of any race, creed, or color." Though Korematsu and Hirabayashi did their best to fight against the government, one person did it successfully, and that was Mitsuye Endo. Endo was a plaintiff, which meant that she filed lawsuits and took responsibility to provide allegations. One day, lawyer James Purcell offered that she should sue the US government for unjustified reasons of internment. Though hesitant, she agreed. In her own words, she says, "I agreed to do it at that moment because it's for the good of everybody. And so I said, well, if that's it, I'll go ahead and do it." Then on July 12, 1942, she filed that the government could not imprison Japanese Americans without trial. Around 2 years later then, on December 18, 1944, the Supreme Court issued the final ruling, given by Justice William O. Douglas. "We are of the view that Mitsuye Endo should be given her liberty. War Relocation Army has no authority to subject citizens who are conceitedly loyal. Mitsuye Endo's responsibility to protect the rights of Japanese Americans is inspirational, and she worked hard to achieve a victory." And lastly, one person I found interesting as well was Richard Aoki, an Asian American Black Panther who joined the fight for both Black and Asian equality during the 60s. He took his experiences from his early life in the internment camps to fight back, this time for Black rights as well, making his presence in the Black Panther Party astonishing. What all four of these people have in common was that they all felt this sense of responsibility that they needed to protect the rights of their ethnicity, their identification. They didn't just fight for themselves, they were selfless fighters who wanted everyone to benefit from their actions. After the end of World War II, Japanese Americans found it difficult to be hired in jobs and returned back to their normal life. Some people returned to see their house vandalized in racist remarks, but they continued to move on. Some even moved away from the East Coast to avoid the racism lingering around. Around 4 years later, the United States recognized that almost $400 million in property were lost during internment camps, so they offered $38 million in compensation total. But some weren't able to receive it, and it was only a fraction of what was lost. That's why President Ronald Reagan, elected 40 years after, apologized for the United States' actions, and notably said this:
"This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race."
Although the money given in compensation was nowhere near to what was lost, the United States also tried their best to apologize and sincerely try to show what they've done wasn't fair to Japanese Americans. So in the end, the rights of Japanese Americans were taken away after Pearl Harbor as a result of fear-mongering and racist remarks displayed by propaganda in which Japanese Americans felt responsible to protest and even fight legal court cases to re-establish equality and treatments towards all US citizens no matter the race. When we study history, whether recent or old, we need to recognize that any type of discrimination or invalid judgments based on race can hurt everyone. And when it comes to this time period, where many minorities were facing unequal treatment, we need to learn and hear the voices of the past so we can establish a brighter future.